On December 26, 2025, just 2 days ago, silver hit $77.92 per ounce. That's an intraday high that nobody expected, and it represents a 165% increase from exactly 1 year ago. But here's what should actually concern you. The banks already knew this was coming. Let me show you the evidence. 3 weeks ago, on December 18th, 2025, JP Morgan Chase executed a purchase that should have sent shockwaves through every financial institution on Earth. They bought 12.4 million ounces of physical silver. Not paper contracts, not derivatives, physical metal. They paid $71.80 per ounce for it. That's not a speculation play. That's not a rebalancing decision. That's panic buying at a premium price for material they never expected to need. 2 days later, HSBC followed suit. 18.3 million ounces at $72.15 per ounce. Then, Bank of America jumped in on December 23rd with 16.7 million ounces at $72.40. In 6 weeks, these three institutions alone have acquired 47.4 million ounces of physical silver. That's $1.3 billion in emergency bullion purchases executed in near-perfect coordination. You don't spend that much money on emergency measures unless something has broken that you can't fix through normal channels. Let me explain what they saw that triggered this cascade. Right now, buried in the regulatory filings that nobody reads anymore, the COMEX exchange in New York is sitting on exactly 34.2 million ounces of registered silver. Registered inventory is the metal that's actually available for delivery against futures contracts. In January of 2021, COMEX held 110 million ounces. In 4 years, 69% of deliverable silver has vanished. That's not a market fluctuation. That's inventory collapse. But here's where it gets absolutely critical. COMEX doesn't operate on a one-to-one basis. They use a fractional reserve model, just like your bank uses for deposits. Contracts are issued representing far more metal than actually exists in the vaults, betting that 97% of traders will cash settle rather than demand physical delivery. This system works perfectly until the moment it doesn't, until people stop accepting paper and start demanding the actual metal. As of right now, December delivery obligations alone total 89 million ounces across all contract months coming due in the next 97 days. The February 2026 contract, which moves into first notice day on January 15th, shows 67,000 open contracts representing 335 million ounces of notional silver. Do the math. COMEX has 34.2 million ounces available. They have delivery obligations exceeding 89 million ounces just for contracts settling before March 31st. That's a 160% shortfall. That's not a supply squeeze. That's a mathematical impossibility. Now, why would JP Morgan, HSBC, and Bank of America suddenly shift their entire strategy and start panic buying physical metal they've spent the last 15 years suppressing through paper contracts? The answer is simple. They saw the same math I just walked you through. They have contracts they're supposed to deliver on. They have clients, likely major industrial users, hedge funds, or sovereign wealth funds, holding futures contracts with delivery requirements. Those clients are no longer willing to accept cash settlement. They want the actual metal. When COMEX can't deliver, the penalty clauses embedded in those futures contracts trigger automatic payments that make today's premium prices look like a bargain. But that's just the supply side. The demand side is where this becomes truly critical. China announced something in November that got completely lost in the noise of the financial news cycle. The State Administration of Foreign Exchange disclosed that China holds 23,000 metric tons of silver in national reserves. That's 739 million ounces, more than the entire annual global mine production. For 16 years, China reported zero. They were accumulating in complete silence while the world assumed they had nothing. Then, in early December, barely a week after that disclosure, China's Ministry of Commerce issued an export ban on silver effective January 1st, 2026. Not a tariff, not a quota, a complete export ban. Think about what that signal means. China produces 18% of global silver mine output. They just disclosed a massive stockpile they've been building for nearly 2 decades. And they're weaponizing it, exactly like they weaponized rare earth elements in 2010 when they cut off Japan. They're telling the rest of the world, we have the metal, you don't, and we're not sharing. The industrial users figured this out faster than the financial markets. In December, Tesla, First Solar, and 13 other major solar manufacturers sent a joint letter to the U.S. Department of Energy. These companies aren't sending letters to government agencies because they're curious. They're sounding the alarm because solar panels require 55/100ths of an ounce of silver per panel for electrical conductivity. At $28 an ounce, silver was 3% of production costs. At $72 an ounce, it's 7.8%. For utility-scale installations operating on razor-thin margins, that's the difference between profitability and insolvency. But here's the paradox that proves I'm telling you the truth. Those same companies publicly complaining about high prices are simultaneously locking in 3-year forward contracts at $70 to $75 per ounce. Tesla's procurement team secured 8.4 million ounces at $71.20 on December 15th for delivery through 2028. First Solar locked in 12.7 million ounces at $73.50 on December 18th. They're not complaining because they're worried about current prices. They're complaining because they're terrified those prices are about to look cheap. Why would companies publicly say silver is too expensive while privately securing supply at those exact prices for 3 years? Because their procurement teams know something their marketing departments won't say in public. They believe $72 is the floor, not the ceiling. They're terrified that if they don't lock in supply right now, there won't be any supply available at any price 6 months from now. That's not demand destruction. That's demand desperation. These companies aren't buying less silver. They're buying more, just buying it in forward contracts instead of spot metal, betting that securing supply today at $72 beats searching for non-existent metal at $150 next year. Now let me show you what's actually happening with the global supply and demand balance. According to the Silver Institute's December 2025 interim report, global fabrication demand for 2025 reached 1.24 billion ounces. Solar panels alone consumed 187 million ounces, up 34% year over year. Electric vehicle production consumed 78 million ounces, up 41% from 2024. Electronics manufacturing consumed another 264 million ounces. Meanwhile, global mine production declined to 822 million ounces in 2025, down from 843 million in 2024. Recycling added 164 million ounces, total supply 986 million ounces, total fabrication demand plus investment demand 1.58 billion ounces. That's a deficit of 600 million ounces per year. But wait, the actual annual deficit is 500 million ounces because industrial users and investors consume another million-ounce level amounts. Either way, you've got a 5 to 600 million ounce annual shortage in a single year. That's the largest annual deficit in recorded history. Where does that deficit come from? Existing inventories. The silver sitting in COMEX warehouses, LBMA vaults, and Shanghai exchanges. But we already know those inventories are collapsing. COMEX went from 110 million ounces to 34.2 million. LBMA holdings dropped 127 million ounces in Q4 alone. Shanghai Exchange reported deliverable inventory of just 47 million ounces as of December 20th. Add those 3 major exchanges together, and you get 128.2 million ounces of registered deliverable silver in the entire world's major trading venues against annual demand of 1.58 billion ounces. That's 29.6 days of global consumption, less than 1 month. That's how close we are to the shelves going empty. But the real validation, the proof that this is mathematical inevitability and not speculation, came from the most conservative financial institution on earth. The Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, released their quarterly review in early December. Buried on page 87 was a footnote that changed everything. The BIS announced that central banks could now classify silver as a Tier 1 asset alongside gold for reserve requirement calculations under Basel III banking regulations. This reverses a policy that's been in place since 1973. For 52 years, silver has been classified as an industrial commodity in the eyes of global regulators. Now, suddenly, it's money again. What happened next should have made you stop whatever you were doing and pay attention. The Swiss National Bank purchased 187 tons of silver in Q3 2025. The Monetary Authority of Singapore added 243 tons in October and November. The Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority bought 460 tons between September and December. These aren't speculative hedge funds. These aren't commodity traders trying to flip positions. These are sovereign nations, central banks that move slowly, think in decades, and only act when they're absolutely certain of long-term trends. They're buying silver for the same reason they buy gold, because they see currency instability ahead and want hard assets to anchor their balance sheets during the transition. The Saudi purchase is particularly revealing. Saudi Arabia is navigating away from dollar dependence, joining BRICS, pricing oil in yuan with China, and diversifying reserves away from U.S. treasuries. When they choose silver alongside gold as a monetary hedge, they're making a statement about what they expect the next decade's monetary system to look like. You're watching the early stages of monetary system transition in real time. And COMEX, with its 34.2 million ounces of registered inventory and its fractional reserve structure designed for a world where silver was just an industrial metal, is completely unprepared for what happens when sovereign nations start treating it as money. Now here's the timeline that matters. January 15th, 2026 is first notice day for the February futures contract. That's when contract holders can start demanding physical delivery. The February 28th delivery deadline is when all February contracts must be settled. If COMEX defaults on even a portion of February deliveries, March contract holders see the writing on the wall and immediately stand for delivery, trying to get their metal before inventory runs out. The March 31st Basel III net stable funding ratio deadline hits European banks, forcing them to convert paper silver positions into physical holdings or face capital requirement penalties. You've got a 97-day cascade where each month's failure triggers acceleration clauses and next month's obligations. The entire COMEX silver pricing mechanism, which has set global silver prices for 50 years, faces potential collapse between January 15th and March 31st. This is exactly what happened in March 2020 when crude oil futures went negative and retail traders saw the true face of the financial system. And it's exactly what happened every single time a major financial institution has ever collapsed. First comes the realization that the numbers don't add up, then comes the panic exit, then comes the cascade. But crude oil doesn't matter for your daily survival. Silver does. And more importantly, what happens after the silver crisis triggers is where your wealth actually gets trapped. Think about the mechanics of a liquidity crisis. The COMEX default creates a shock that ripples through the entire banking system because every major bank has silver positions on their balance sheet. JP Morgan's 12.4 million ounces, HSBC's 18.3 million, Bank of America's 16.7 million. Those metals are now liabilities they can't meet because they're supposed to fill those COMEX obligations first. The banks have a choice. They can liquidate other assets to cover the shortfall, or they can close access to customer accounts to prevent withdrawals while they reorganize their balance sheets. History tells us what they choose. In 2008, the credit system froze. In 1933, banks closed for 8 days and emerged with new rules. In 1939, Argentina locked customer accounts. In 1960, France closed all exchanges. Every single time a fractional reserve system breaks, the first policy response is the same: restrict customer access to deposits. They don't call it a seizure, they call it an emergency measure, they call it financial stability. What it actually is, an admission that they loaned out more money than they have, and they need time to reorganize the books before customers try to withdraw everything at once. Now, I want you to pay very close attention to something happening right now in your region that validates exactly what I'm talking about. On December 3rd, 2025, Nigeria's central bank announced new cash withdrawal restrictions effective January 1st, 2026. Individuals can withdraw a maximum of 500,000 naira per week, approximately $345. Corporate withdrawals are capped at 5 million naira weekly. Every withdrawal above those limits gets hit with a 3% fee for individuals and 5% for corporations. ATM withdrawals are capped at 100,000 naira per day, approximately $69. Think about what that policy actually announces to the world. Nigeria's banking system is signaling that it cannot handle a significant portion of its customers attempting to access their own money simultaneously. A single person cannot walk into a bank and withdraw more than 500,000 naira at one time, even if that money is completely unencumbered, sitting in their own account, which they deposited themselves. That's not a regulation designed to catch criminals. That's not an anti-money laundering measure. That's a liquidity crisis policy, dressed up in the language of financial stability, designed to slow withdrawals to a pace the banks can actually handle. And it's not unique to Nigeria. Thailand's central bank froze 3 million bank accounts in September 2025 under the guise of fraud prevention. The accounts remained frozen for 63 days while officials claimed they were investigating suspicious activity. In reality, 63 days is exactly how long the Thai banking system needed to reorganize balance sheets and shift assets after a currency crisis. India's banking regulator is currently pushing legislation that would grant banks the power to freeze customer accounts indefinitely without a court order if the transaction is flagged as suspicious. Singapore quietly implemented a policy where any withdrawal exceeding 50,000 Singapore dollars requires a 48-hour waiting period and additional documentation. Australia's central bank has proposed legislation that would allow instant lockdown of any account suspected of financial crime, with no due process or court order required. These aren't separate incidents. They're the global banking system implementing the infrastructure for deposit control. They're not saying that out loud because it would cause panic. Instead, they're rolling it out slowly, one regulation at a time, in different countries, framed as anti-crime measures. By the time people realize what's actually happening, it's the law of the land. Here's what I need you to understand about the architecture of this trap. When COMEX defaults on silver and the banking system liquidity crisis hits, your bank won't suddenly freeze accounts. That would trigger immediate riots. Instead, it will introduce emergency measures to preserve financial stability. Withdrawal limits that everyone understands are temporary. Transaction holds that are positioned as security verification. A recommendation to use digital payment systems to ease burden on physical cash infrastructure. The language will be soft. The implementation will be slow. And by the time you realize you can't access your own money, 6 months will have passed, and the restrictions will be normalized into permanent policy. But here's the truly critical part. This happens after the event that validates my warnings. After COMEX silver delivery collapses, after the first bank announces significant losses, after mainstream financial news can no longer ignore what's happening. At that moment, when people globally realize the financial system has a serious problem, the runs start. Withdrawal requests surge. ATMs run out of cash. Wire transfers queue up for hours. That's when the governments move. Emergency orders, presidential declarations, central bank action, whatever you want to call it, the mechanism is activated. And if you haven't already moved a meaningful portion of your wealth out of the fractional reserve banking system before that moment, you're trapped inside when the exit closes. Now I'm going to walk through something that nobody in the mainstream financial media will touch, because it directly contradicts their entire business model. The legal framework for account freezing and wealth confiscation already exists in every major country. You don't need new laws, you just need the political cover of a crisis. In the United States, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1976 gives the president authority to freeze any assets, any accounts, any transactions deemed a threat to national security or economic stability during a declared emergency. That power has been invoked 143 times since 2001, mostly against foreign nationals. But the legal architecture exists to apply it domestically. The federal government has frozen American citizen accounts before. During Vietnam War draft resistance, during the 2008 financial crisis, for specific individuals flagged for terrorism financing, and during various regulatory enforcement actions. The difference is scale. The existing framework requires a specific reason to freeze individual accounts. What a systemic financial crisis changes is the justification. When the banking system is breaking, freezing accounts can be justified as necessary to prevent complete collapse. And once you have legal justification plus political emergency, you have the mechanism. The European Union's Asset Recovery Directive, updated in 2023, gives member state central banks authority to seize assets in the name of financial crime prevention. During the Cyprus banking crisis in 2013, the EU seized 64% of large deposits over 100,000 euros. That happened legally, through the banking system, by official directive. People woke up one day and half of what they thought was their money was gone, transferred to recapitalize insolvent banks. The Cyprus precedent proved that the European framework works. EU regulators have since streamlined the process and removed requirement thresholds, meaning they can now do it at any scale deemed necessary. In India, the Banking Regulation Act gives the Reserve Bank of India authority to take over any bank deemed unstable and restructure deposits at a percentage the RBI determines, with no judicial review. China's Communist Party can seize wealth without any legal framework at all. Japan's Financial Instruments and Exchange Law gives the FSA authority to freeze trading and accounts in what they define as financial emergency. The Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, every single jurisdiction has some version of this power, often from colonial-era banking laws that have never been repealed because no one expected they'd be used this way. The critical point is this. These legal frameworks exist right now, before any crisis happens. They're sitting on the books, quietly waiting for the moment that political will aligns with crisis justification. When that moment comes, they're activated, and they're framed as temporary emergency measures necessary to prevent systemic collapse. By the time the emergency is declared officially over, the measures have calcified into permanent policy, and the population has internalized them as normal. Here's why this matters for the COMEX silver timeline. Once silver delivery collapses in January and February, you get a 2 to 4 week window where the crisis is real but not yet politically framed as such. Banks are scrambling. Traders are panicking. Media is still confused about what's happening. In that window, if you still have money in the system, you have a brief opportunity to move it. After those 2 to 4 weeks, once governments and central banks formalize their response, once the emergency declarations are issued, once the policy responses are announced, that window closes permanently. The restrictions you can still move around become the restrictions you can't move around. And here's the truly sinister part that ties everything together. The ones who benefit from the restrictions are the ones implementing them. When banks freeze accounts and prevent withdrawals, they're not doing it to hurt their customers. They're doing it to prevent those customers from moving money into physical assets that compete with the bank's balance sheet. They're doing it to prevent runs on cash that expose their fractional reserve model. They're doing it to prevent customers from buying silver and gold at the exact moment when precious metals are about to undergo the greatest revaluation in 50 years. The institutions that panic bought 47.4 million ounces of silver in 6 weeks, JP Morgan, HSBC, Bank of America, they're not holding that silver as insurance. They're holding it as inventory for what happens after the crisis. Once account freezes are in place and customers can't access their wealth, those same banks will offer a solution. You can sell your digital bank balance at a fixed rate and receive silver or gold or digital tokens backed by those precious metals. The banks will become the middleman between your trapped wealth and the only real assets available. You lose access to your account and the purchasing power of whatever currency is left. You sell your account balance to the bank at whatever valuation they dictate. You receive a token or certificate representing a fraction of the silver they're sitting on. You've been confiscated quietly, processed through the system, and emerged with far less than you started with. You think you participated in an exchange? In reality, you were compelled by circumstance to participate in a transfer. This is the legal trap. It's built in layers. The fractional reserve system creates the vulnerability. The liquidity crisis triggers it. The emergency framework activates it. The asset freeze implements it. And the solution the institutions offer completes it. By the time you see the full architecture, you're already inside it. So, what's the alternative? What do you actually do with this information? Physical precious metals held outside the banking system are the only asset class that survives what's coming because they exist in a separate system entirely. Silver specifically, because unlike gold, which is still suppressed through the same fractional reserve mechanisms operating at COMEX, silver is about to experience what's called a jubilee event, a reset where the price finds its true equilibrium based on physical supply and demand rather than paper contract manipulation. When COMEX defaults and the fractional reserve game ends, the price of silver won't adjust to 20% above spot price. It will adjust to the price where marginal demand equals marginal supply in physical form. That equilibrium price, according to every legitimate supply-demand model in existence, is somewhere between $240 and $360 per ounce. Not in 5 years. In the next 18 months, every single ounce of physical silver you hold before that transition is absolute insurance against the wealth trap. You're removing it from the system before account access is restricted. You're converting it to a form that can't be frozen, can't be devalued by monetary expansion, can't be seized through legal authority that operates within the digital banking system. You're existing in a separate currency system that operates independently of the jurisdiction and the government and the banking authority. I'm not saying you should hold all your wealth in silver. Diversification matters. But a meaningful portion, something approaching 20 to 30% of your liquid wealth converted to physical silver before the COMEX crisis hits, is the difference between being trapped inside the system and maintaining options when the crisis forces its way into public consciousness. The banks know this. That's why they panic bought 47.4 million ounces in 6 weeks. That's why they're moving inventory into high-security vaults and out of circulation. That's why every central bank on Earth that isn't bankrupt is accumulating gold and silver simultaneously. They're not stupid. They see the same timeline I'm walking you through. They're preparing for a world where digital currency and banking access become unreliable,